But there is clearly, of course, nothing to say that somehow or other that these methodologies are foolproof or that they guarantee that one is either going to be right or relevant. And I think one of the saddest ironies in relation to General Motors is that, in fact, their research in the 60s threw up some extraordinary prototype output. But as has been pointed out by Michael Schrage in his book, Serious Play, about corporate prototyping, you have to engage with your prototypes. You can build them and then you can put them away, and then you can build them, they can work beautifully, and people can even say we love them, which of course happened with the General Motors electric vehicle, the EV, which they, for all sorts of reasons which are still not entirely clear, canned.
Yeah. And
General Motors had done that in the 60s with some remarkable prototypes, which got similarly shelved. So there's no guarantee. The process can produce beautiful outcomes, but they can also be shelved. They can be garaged. So I think the issue in all of this is, in some senses, back to that of communication. The prototyping can draw on a lot of tacit knowledge, can initiate conversations, can become a territory for experimentation and innovation, create extraordinary results, but if that is then not communicated, and if that is then not used as a tool to initiate a wider conversation, then that can become irrelevant. And the conversation that you might be actually trying to usurp or to change will continue to be the dominant conversation. And I don't believe, for the most part, that good ideas or even valuable ideas necessarily sell themselves. And I think that's one of the problems that the design community, that we often don't engage with. We can be struck by things that appear to be very relevant and appealing solutions, and then are terribly disappointed when they don't emerge as practice. But I think that, again, this communication issue is absolutely crucial to moving forward.
But we talked about your projects earlier. We sort of took a more systemic or more functional sort of approach to talk about them. But given this, I'm sort of wondering, do you in fact have a way of looking at your projects as vehicles of communication, which is that, I mean, what seems to come through when I look at your work again and again is that you have a huge amount of theoretical exploration, and then the project becomes the vehicle for you to sort of push, in effect, push all your explorations out through. So is there something there in terms of your projects being vehicles of your communication?
I think that the thing that I'd like to see us bring out through our projects is the idea that design could produce outcomes that permit the users more freedom or greater control, or even some sort of creative input into how spaces are used. In the early 90s, while I was doing my master's at RMIT, and Leon Van Skyke was my supervisor, I, with Anthony Kitchener and with Joseph Brabe, worked on a project to develop a kind of house of the future, which was very much a toolbox of emergent technologies. And I think there were two very strong outcomes for me that came from that project. And they could be characterized by these two words, filter and expression. The first filter is that from a technological point of view or a functional point of view, space and design can act as a kind of physical carapace that permits you certain kinds of access and protects you in other ways. And I think in its most liberated form, it can kind of be, it's an autonomous. It's a notion of autonomy, which you've talked about in relation to industrial design. But the second idea of expression, it seemed to me that particularly with the layering of digital technology into space, the digital technology need not stop at merely controlling the air conditioning system or the solar cell delivery to particular appliances given the weather. But that with that overlay, that should become a tool where space itself becomes something that you can play with, and that you can construct ambiences and you can manipulate your environment like a kind of canvas. And I think those two ideas, this filter notion and the expression notion, are manifest in most of our projects subsequently. They may not be coherently manifest, but they're manifest in our address of the projects. With Crowd, we literally take fragments, I guess, of the proposition of the Hyperhouse project and try and actualize them. And so in Hoyt's, it was this idea of digital walls, and they can have all sorts of different outcomes. With the RTA project in New South Wales, where we were trying to make a real change to the way in which the registries for the RTA are experienced and used by their customers. A lot of our thinking, in fact, revolved around the selection of furniture. And we had a particular brief, and Veronica Saunders, our interior designer, took on what was an impossible brief to create a kind of very fluid and flexible furniture environment that looked like a lounge room and yet was designed to prevent any of it being weaponized by the customers. This was a great fear on the part of the RTA management. So that was being driven, however, by this idea about, in some way, the kind of enabling capacity, some shadow of this idea of expression. So these get manifest in lots of different ways. But I think those two principles are always driving the projects, and I think we assess the projects often in terms of what they tell us about those principles.
Have you ever indulged or sort of gone into the sort of realm of some sort of a technological utopia? The technology in these little incremental ways is going to make things better. And then, voila, everything is going to be different and much better.
I think there's clearly a fragment of that thinking in our approach. There's absolutely no question. And I think it comes back to this idea that if one is fascinated by the potential for human creativity, in a sense, you're somehow or other already being rather optimistic. Rather than it only being about mischief and dis-ease, there's a sense that human creativity not only is rewarding in some sort of emotional way, but is somehow that contributive to a better world. Now, I think that can only really be described as utopian, in the sense that one is not taking up a position of defense or conservation in that regard, but rather more believing that new options, new opportunities may potentially of value, rather than inevitably disastrous or likely to be very mischievous.